Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Tonight we are very honored to have a very prestigious speaker with us. Tonight's speaker is Ambassador Neville Kanakiratne from Sri Lanka. Ambassador Kanakiratne is a leader in international politics and has a long history of international involvement, including membership in Dr. Henry Kissinger's 1956 International Seminar at Harvard. He was also a member of the Ceylonese delegation to the United Nations Law of the Sea Conference and the Human Rights Commission. Ambassador Kanakiratne has served as ambassador to the United States and Mexico since 1970 and has become a leader and spokesman of the Third World and Asian countries. The ambassador has attended many recent international conferences, including the meeting of heads of state of non-aligned nations in Colombo, Sri Lanka. He also served as chairman of the Sri Lankan delegation to the 31st session of the United Nations General Assembly. I am honored to present Ambassador Neville Kanakiratne.
Mr. Chairman, friends, let me first thank the Institute of World Affairs of this university for having invited me here tonight to speak to you as part of this seminar on human dignity, survival or disaster in South Asia. I must express my gratification to you who have braved the inclement weather conditions outside this building tonight in having come here, and I am sure that if you could have done that, you must be very closely and vitally interested in what's happening in the world outside the state of Iowa and indeed the United States of America. I wish tonight to speak to you, or rather to think aloud in your presence about one or two aspects of South Asia which you might think have little relevance to the theme of this seminar which has been going on in these halls during the last few days, namely human dignity, survival or disaster, with South Asia as a microcosm of that global problem. Those of you who had the temerity or the, shall I say, rashness to sit up till midnight in front of your televisions sets watching last night's Channel 5 Dimension might have heard some of the observations that I myself and some other colleagues from South Asia and indeed from the United States had to say about the whole question of human dignity. But tonight I wish to speak to you very briefly and in broad outline on the perspective within which the question of human dignity in any part of the world, and certainly in South Asia, have to be viewed. And after my remarks, I would very much like you to ask me as many questions as you consider necessary. Perhaps you may even wish to cross-examine me, which, as originally a trained lawyer, I will do my best to answer on what I say in my preliminary remarks. To those of you who have read through the brochure giving the program of this seminar, it might have occurred perhaps that it is strange that one of the final speakers in the series should speak on what appears to be a pure political issue, namely great power rivalry in South Asia, which doesn't, on first appearances, seem to be relevant to the problems of world hunger, of population growth, of human rights, and of the dignity of the human person in South Asia. But I, partly because I'm a professional diplomat and therefore spend much of my time with my colleagues in Washington and other capitals discussing the political scenario within which everything, fortunately or unfortunately, is worked out in today's world, but partly also as a political animal, a citizen of my country, a citizen of the Asian continent, and indeed a citizen of the world, have to look at these things. We have of late, and I think quite rightly, begun to stress the importance of human rights, of the dignity of the human person, and of the value of the human individual in the greater context of national and international rivalries. But I would like to be frank with you this evening and to place before you certain perspectives which some of you may not have properly appreciated in the days gone by, perspectives with which you may totally disagree, and indeed points of view which you may feel that it is your duty as American citizens, nationals of one of the major powers in the world today, to correct me. And I would be very happy indeed to welcome your views on these problems. As I said earlier, fortunately or unfortunately, politics tends to dominate all governments in the world, whether they are governments of large, powerful, affluent nations like the United States, the Soviet Union, the European countries, and Japan, or governments of countries as small and as weak and as economically poor as my own, which after all is one of the smaller countries in the international community. Sri Lanka, better known to you in the past as Ceylon, has a population of not more than, or indeed not less than, 13 million people inhabiting a land territory not larger than the state of West Virginia or the island of Ireland in the international community. So we really belong, population-wise, into the, if you like, the lower middle class of the international community. We do not have a population of 900 million people like the People's Republic of China does, nor 600 million people like India does, nor do we have the economic muscle that countries like the United States, the Federal Republic of Germany, Japan, Canada, and such like countries have. We do not even fall into the group of the nouveau riche nations that have joined the world community. I mean the oil-producing countries of the Middle East and Africa and Latin America. But we belong to a small coterie of countries in which I am proud to associate with my own, countries such as Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Finland, which in the years in which we have been politically independent of the British Crown, in other words, since 1948, all our governments successively have tried to put as their first priority the raising of the living standards of our peoples. And in order to do so, we have taken deliberate political decisions to avoid being or becoming involved in the international political and military problems that have, unfortunately, in the years immediately after the Second World War, divided the world into the so-called West and the so-called East. We have, on the other hand, consistently tried to follow in our foreign policy a deliberate commitment, if that's the proper word, to the principle of friendship with all nations and peaceful coexistence with all nations, regardless of their size, regardless of their affluence, regardless of their system of government, and indeed regardless of the political ideology to which they may subscribe. With the result that in the recent past we have had very good and very cordial relations with the United States of America, with the Soviet Union, with the People's Republic of China as the three major countries. We have had exceptionally warm relations with our former colonial masters, the British government. We have had similarly good relations with all the individual members of the European community. We have had equally good relations with the socialist countries of Eastern Europe. We have had very warm historical and current relationships with our big and potentially great neighbor, the country of India. But that did not prevent us from at the same time cultivating and achieving and maintaining good relations with Pakistan on the one hand and with Bangladesh since its birth on the other. To that extent, we have succeeded, I believe, as a small country in avoiding entanglement with the historical, political and military problems which have made confrontation situations between other nations. We have done this for two reasons. First, as I said, our prime objective in policy was to raise the living standards of our people, which simply means a stress on the economic problems facing the country rather than on getting involved in military alliances which would push us into this or that camp ideologically or politically. Secondly, it is our firm belief that in the context of the post-war period of the Cold War, as it has generally come to be known, small countries like mine, like Austria, for instance, in Europe, or like the Scandinavian countries, like Tunisia in North Africa, like Colombia and Mexico in Latin America, we did have a role which we hoped to play in the United Nations and elsewhere of trying to be the good, honest broker. And as always happens, in disputant situations, the brokers are the ones who come off worst because their motives are suspected, their efforts are denigrated, and indeed their results, if at all they achieve any, are regarded as irrelevant. But that has not prevented small countries like my own from pursuing wherever possible, normally through modest diplomatic channels, but sometimes through initiatives in the United Nations of trying to bring understanding where understanding appeared to us to be the major area of area which lacked sufficient pressure, for instance, in situations between the Soviet Union and the United States itself, in situations between India and China in 1962 during the Indo-China conflict. Countries like mine, and I don't say mine alone, tried to use their good offices in the United Nations and outside. As far as the United Nations is concerned, Sri Lanka has, through the last 22 years during which she has been a member, we have given to the General Assembly our membership of the Security Council, our membership of the Human Rights Commission, our Vice Presidency of the General Assembly, and indeed last year, the President of the General Assembly. The present President of the Law of the Sea Conference, perhaps one of the most important diplomatic conferences ever to be held, happens to be the Sri Lanka Ambassador to the United Nations. The Secretary General of UNCTAD happens to be a national of my country, and UNCTAD, as you know, is a vitally important agency of the United Nations in the efforts to solve the economic divisions between the affluent, industrialized North and the poor agricultural South. In this way, we have tried to help the international community to resolve whatever problems history and the economic situation and the advance of science and technology have created between nations. But despite all these efforts, there are still, in certain quarters, the hangover, if that's the proper word, from the contentious situations which arose immediately after the World War was over. I have had many situations in addressing audiences in these United States and in many parts of them, in the Midwest, in the South, in the far West, and indeed in the East Coast of the United States, in being asked about whether or not we are suspicious of the motivations of the communist countries, meaning particularly the Soviet Union, and sometimes, indeed, during the Vietnam War, of the People's Republic of China. And my answer has been simply this, that it would be impertinent for an ambassador of a small country to tell an American audience that the communists should or should not be trusted, or that the Vietnamese war from the American point of view was or was not justified. Only the government of a country can decide what its own national security interests are and what its long-term place in the world community can be. The basis of any government's foreign policy must necessarily be, as it has been since Machiavelli first enunciated the doctrine, and it will continue to be in the foreseeable future, its national interests. The difficulties arise when governments try to define what their national interests are, and it is in that field that we believe that the smaller countries can be of some service and some help to the bigger ones in sorting out their problems. Up to the late 1950s, or indeed to the middle 1960s, we had a situation in the world where the two superpowers, the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other, which emerged from the world's most destructive war so far as the two leading nations in the world. In physical suffering, the Soviet Union, of course, suffered more because the war raged on its soil for quite some time, and cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad were besieged by the Germans for long periods of time, and large numbers of Russian inhabitants, citizens, were killed outright. The United States went into the war later than, of course, Western Europe, but it too contributed much in blood, in treasure, apart from anything else, and in its economic development at that time. It created, however, for itself and for the world, a massive example of reconstruction and rehabilitation through the Marshall Aid Plan, which enabled Western Europe to recover its stability and, ironically enough, enabled its two principal adversary powers in that war, the Federal Republic of Germany and Japan, to do so well that today in the 1970s, it is those two powers that are a major economic threat to the economy of the United States than the vanquished, than the allies or some of those like us who helped the great Allied war effort in our position as colonies of the British Crown at that time. But time, therefore, changes situations. Today's enemy can become tomorrow's ally, and who knows whether today's ally can or cannot be, or will or will not be tomorrow's enemy. But in that kind of changing situation, it is understandable for the United States or the Soviet Union, or indeed for any country, great or small, to take the necessary steps to protect its national interests. No one in his right mind will question the obligation of a government to take all necessary steps in arming itself to protect, first, its territorial integrity, second, its national independence, and thirdly, its vital economic interests. If, therefore, there is a fear that there will be a threat to American territory, it would be perfectly justifiable for the Americans to feel that they are under an obligation to arm themselves. By the same token, if the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics feel that there is a threat to its territorial integrity, it must necessarily be understood that it has a right to arm itself in order to prevent such a situation. But that unfortunate vicious circle of suspicion and mutual distrust has now produced in 1977, in the last quarter of this century, at a time when man's technological mastery of the universe has enabled him to set foot on the moon and enabled all of us to view on our television screens what the planet Mars looks like. At such a time, the world is spending $350 billion on destructive armaments. And these are not armaments which are restricted to use by combatants against combatants. The days of the old wars in trenches, where on Christmas Eve, the French and the British soldiers on one side and the German soldiers on the other could stop their fighting and sing to each other, "Silent Night, Holy Night," those days are gone. Because wars begin now without declaration. Wars know no frontiers. Wars know no distinction between the armed military personnel of an enemy and its civilian inhabitants. It knows no distinction between rich and poor, between old and young, between the hale and the weak and the sick. It is in these circumstances that we are considerably perturbed by the massive direction or diversion of financial and human resources to the multiplication of weapons which can only end, if used, in the total annihilation of the vast mass of the human inhabitants of this planet. And as science advances, man's wisdom appears to be moving backwards. We cannot blame science or the scientists, and it will be a brash man who comes into such an important and well-known research center as AIIMS to criticize science or the scientific community. The fault lies with those in whose hands lie the political decisions which will direct the results of science and science's achievements. If $350 billion could be diverted, even fractionally, towards such important areas of economic survival as the production of larger quantities of food, of the provision of purer water, of the building of more habitable and more pleasant dwellings for the human community, if it could be diverted to prevent avoidable and preventable diseases from time to time sweeping away hundreds of thousands of human beings, if it could be diverted to raising the living standards of the people, and indeed if it could be diverted to preventing 6 million children dying on this planet, infants, before they reach the age of 3. That is the perspective which I wish to place before you today in the context of human dignity, survival or disaster in South Asia. In South Asia, we have a situation where comparatively there has been a period of lack of international confrontation. The Atlantic, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, amongst the oceans of the world, indeed the continents of Europe, of Africa even, of Latin America and of East Asia have been not only the areas of ideological conflict, but in recent years some of them have been actually the grounds or the venue of military combat. The South Asian region, by which I mean the subcontinent, including the island of Sri Lanka, and the peripheral nations, perhaps of Afghanistan, Nepal, Burma on the fringe, and the Indian Ocean area, have been comparatively free of great power confrontation in the sense of the outbreak of military hostilities or the aggravation of the Cold War. But unfortunately, there have been a continuation of what we would call the token part of the Cold War continuing in the subcontinental region. For this, we of the subcontinent, and I am a native of Sri Lanka, which is a part of the subcontinent of Asia, known as the Indian subcontinent. Culturally and otherwise, we are closely linked to our Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi colleagues. We cannot overlook the fact that the two major nations of that area have perhaps unwittingly contributed to that situation. From the birth of the republics of India and Pakistan after the partition of the great Indian Empire in 1947, there has been, perhaps historically understandable, though not necessarily justifiable, a Cold War between India and Pakistan. And this situation has bedeviled the peace and serenity of an area which otherwise could have converted its concentration, its human resources, of which there is a massive massive source, its financial, its technological and other skills, to building up all of us within the subcontinental region to higher standards of living and better expectations from life. But the fact that in the circumstances in which these two nations were born, and I do not wish to go into the rights or wrongs, it is sufficient for me to say that if I was a Pakistani and if I was an Indian, I would probably have reacted exactly as my Pakistani and my Indian brothers would have done. But since I am neither a Pakistani or an Indian national but a Sri Lankan, I can perhaps afford to be a little less subjective in judging that situation than either nationals of those two countries. But the fact that those two nations, from their very birth, which unfortunately resulted in a considerable amount of bloodshed on the subcontinent, the great powers or the superpowers decided to play games in that area. And we had this situation, and in the 1940s, late 1940s and the 1950s, the Cold War was almost beginning to become acute. And both the United States and the Soviet Union, as they had been doing in other parts of the world, decided deliberately, if I may say so, to play their Cold War through proxy states. Pakistan joined the United States in two military alliances, CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, on its European wing, and SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, on its Asian wing. India refused to commit itself militarily, and Prime Minister Nehru was one of the most outstanding advocates of what has now come to be called the policies of non-alignment. And he refused to join either of the military alliances with the Soviet Union or the United States. And he said, however, that ideologically, India is firmly committed to the rule of law, to the principles of democracy, to freedom of assembly, to freedom of religion, and those ideals for which the Western world has stood in the past, and I'm sure stands today. But Pakistan, because of its overt suspicion of India's intention, and being perhaps the weaker of the two nations, thought it would be safer from a security point of view to have an umbrella covering them, and these two umbrellas were on the one side CENTO and on the other side SEATO. Now, by joining, in my opinion, those two organizations, Pakistan created for India an extremely difficult position. If you can imagine the map of the world, you will see that the Soviet government at that time was very concerned that the intentions of the United States, as represented by the policies of the late lamented John Foster Dulles, was an encirclement of the Soviet Union. From the northern tip of NATO in Norway and the North Sea, the arc, which included France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan was the end of that arc. And linking NATO with the Middle Eastern countries was CENTO, which consisted of the United States, Iraq before the revolution of 1959, Iran and Turkey, and of course Pakistan. Then Mr. Dulles's circle broke with India, and was picked up again with the SEATO treaty alliances involving Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, right up to Taiwan and to Korea. This situation created for the United States policy at that time a gap in an otherwise successful effort which the Soviets thought, and indeed the Chinese thought too, was an attempt to encircle the two major communist powers. I'm now talking of a time before the split between Moscow and Peking, when it was the thinking in Washington that there was a Moscow-Peking axis determined to introduce world communism all over Asia and Europe. It was our view then, and because we were a small nation, we were not taken too seriously, that we believed that the Moscow-Peking axis was not a substantial fear for the Americans or the Western countries, that it was our interpretation that both the Chinese and the Russians were going to behave in the near future as Russians and Chinese, and not as international communists. And time has proved us right, because the Soviet Union and the Chinese Republic are now facing each other across a massive border with millions, literally, of armed men on either side of that border, worried about their own nationalisms and forgetting for the moment the debt they owe to the international proletariat towards whom they both said they were committed when they started their revolutionary regimes in the years gone by. In that situation, you have found a country like India which to some extent almost challenged the American policies of the Dulles period. And therefore, it was not surprising if India, to use a word which later has become fashionable, tilted towards the Soviet Union. And it is not for me, as ambassador of a country which is in that area, but neither India nor Pakistan, to justify or not these positions, but I am here to try and give you my personal views and the views of the Sri Lanka government on big power rivalry in South Asia. So as the 50s moved into the 60s, you found more and more a closer link between Pakistan and the Western nations on the one hand, and a closer link between India and the Soviet Union, though not a treaty or an alliance link, as the 60s went on. And then, of course, this period was intermittently interrupted by periodic wars between India and Pakistan. There have been 3 wars between India and Pakistan since the two countries became independent 28 or 29 years ago. And in 1971, just before the Bangladesh crisis broke, the Soviet Union and India signed a formal treaty of friendship. And of course, you know the consequences of what has followed, because this is recent and contemporary history. Dr. Kissinger, unfortunately overheard, delivered himself of this famous phrase of tilting towards Pakistan, which didn't improve India's relations with the United States. Now, these are illustrations of the two superpowers being drawn, wittingly or unwittingly, into the South Asian subcontinent, not by their own initiative, but if my Pakistani and Indian friends here in this room will forgive me, by the misjudgments and the errors of judgment and the mistakes made by those two nations themselves. It is for this reason that we in Sri Lanka, a small island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, with India and Pakistan, both are close and warm friends in history, in culture, and in tradition, decided that we will certainly not join either the Soviet Union or the United States in military alliances. We have welcomed both of them if they come as friends. We have refused to allow them to come close to us if they come as masters or expecting certain advantages in the way of naval and military facilities in our island. After all, we cannot forget the fact that Sri Lanka was the headquarters of the Southeast Asia Command under Lord Louis Mountbatten in the later stages of the Second World War. Lord Louis' headquarters were, the SEAC headquarters were in Sri Lanka, for the simple reason, if no other, that that was the only British territory left to the British after the Japanese ravaged the entire Far Eastern Empire of the British. But in that situation, Sri Lanka held and still holds a strategically important position in the Indian Ocean. It was for these reasons, and in 1971, when the Indo-Pakistani-Bangladesh war brought serious difficulties into our region, that my then Prime Minister, Mrs. Bandaranaike, who was very active in international affairs, proposed, first at a meeting of the Commonwealth Prime Ministers in Singapore in January 1971, that the Indian Ocean be declared a zone of peace, whereby all non-littoral powers, that is, all countries which did not border the Indian Ocean, should withdraw all military, naval, and air facilities from that region. That region should be left to be protected in their own interests by the littoral and the hinterland states, meaning the entire set of states on the east coast of Africa, all the states on the north of the Arabian Peninsula, all the states bordering the Indian Ocean on its north, Iran, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Burma, all the way right down to Singapore and Malaysia. At that time, at that conference, the Prime Minister of Britain, Mr. Edward Heath, complimented the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka on her idealism and on her aspirations, but observed that her proposal was totally unrealistic. And he said that the British government will continue to believe that the Indian Ocean was a vital link, economic link, if nothing else, between Europe on the one hand and Australia and Japan on the other, and refused to agree to this proposal. Sri Lanka then brought it up before the United Nations General Assembly in November that year, in 1971, and the General Assembly adopted a resolution by majority declaring the Indian Ocean a zone of peace and requested the Secretary General to appoint a committee of interested nations to provide the necessary information and statistics. And it was all along our guarantee and assurance that every nation in the world, regardless of its politics or its ideology, will be free to use the Indian Ocean for purposes of normal commercial enterprise. The ships of these nations could sail the Indian Ocean because it's a major waterway, it's international waters. The only thing on which we had reservations was the affording of military facilities in the territories of any of our nations to countries which were outside that nation. It didn't prohibit or request the withdrawal only of the Soviet Union and the United States. Even Japan or Germany or China would not have been entitled if our countries agreed to bases or naval facilities in our area. This resolution, when it came to the vote, strangely enough, and perhaps not strangely, both the Soviet Union and the United States abstained. And if the two major governments abstain on a politico-military strategic resolution, then we at least had the consolation to draw the inference that we were not so far wrong from what is best for us. Then, of course, as time went on, these discussions dragged on, and it was with great, shall I say, relief that my government, as the initiator of this proposal, heard President Carter, soon after his inauguration as President of the United States earlier in 1977, on his own initiative, referred to the so-called policy of détente with the Soviet Union and included, apart from the strategic arms limitation talks, the Helsinki Conference and so on, a proposal for both great powers to exercise mutual military restraint in the Indian Ocean, which probably, although it didn't go as far as we were wanting, indicated that the United States administration, for the first time in 20 years or so, was thinking as we were doing. And our thinking behind this proposal was simply that of all the world's major areas, the one area which so far had been comparatively, and I'm stressing the word comparatively, free of great power confrontations, or the likelihood of great power confrontations, was the subcontinental region of South Asia. And it was our hope that this would not only continue to be so, but that the dangers that that position would be jeopardized should be eliminated, and one possible way was this. Now, after Secretary Vance's visit to Moscow and the talks with Mr. Gromyko there earlier this year, several committees were set up for bilateral negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union on several matters, the most important of which, of course, was the SALT negotiations. But one of those committees was to deal with the Indian Ocean. And it is our belief that the President of the United States has taken the correct initiative in the correct direction, and we have thereafter continued to give him our wholehearted support, as indeed have many of the littoral states of the Indian Ocean area. We believe that if there is an area where the clash of arms has still not been sounded, it is in the interest not only of us in the South Asian region, it is in the interest of all of Asia, indeed all of the international community, to ensure that that clash of arms will never be heard. And therefore, if it's not practically possible for everybody to take their naval and military facilities and go off home, at least we can freeze the situation. And from a frozen situation, we can move backwards, therefore lessening the risks of accidental or other collisions between those two nations in an area where nuclear submarines of all countries, meaning the Soviet Union and the United States particularly, have been in operation for quite some time. An area where the Soviet government has until recently had facilities in two African nations, Somalia at the post of Berbera, and further up in the southern Yemen, the island called Socotra. And in retaliation or in response, the United States took over from the British government on long lease a group of atolls called Diego Garcia, which is directly 1,000 miles south of my country. And I believe that is the only bit of landmass between Sri Lanka and Antarctica. To that extent, we were in immediate range of any operations that might be mounted from Diego Garcia. And the American position was that they had to have what they first called communication facilities, but later the Chief of Staff, unwittingly perhaps after or before lunch, either in excitement before lunch or the after effects of lunch, unwittingly told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the Diego Garcia runways were being expanded to enable them to take B-52 bombers, which was hardly a communications expansion. Thereafter, of course, we were concerned about the possibility of the arms race in the Indian Ocean spiraling. Whatever the facilities the Soviets had in Berbera and Socotra could have been extended and expanded if it had come out in congressional evidence that runways in Diego Garcia were being expanded to be able to take in B-52 bombers. And therefore, it would have been perfectly justifiable from a Soviet point of view if they matched the Americans in these expansionary programs. So now, for that reason, we are happy that the President, the American President, has called a halt as far as America is concerned. Since then, much has happened. The Somali government has severed its military connections with the Soviet Union, and it was only 2 weeks ago that the Soviet government had been asked and requested to remove whatever facilities they had in Somalia, although at one time the Somali government publicly denied that there were any facilities. And the situation, therefore, partly by accident and partly by deliberate policy, has eased considerably. And it is our hope that this situation will continue until the Indian Ocean can at least be a zone of comparative peace, if not of peace. Now, the vital purpose, the vital, if you like, support of that position must be an arrangement amongst the major countries of the subcontinent, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And there again, before the changes of government in both the countries, and in fact all three countries, there was the famous Simla Accord between Prime Minister Gandhi and Prime Minister Bhutto, which brought the two countries closer to a negotiated settlement of their problems than they had ever come to for the last 20 years. And no less a person than Dr. Kissinger welcomed this, what he called the spirit of Simla. But unfortunately, the spirit of Simla appears to have been put into cold storage simply because neither of the authors of that accord are today guiding the destinies of their respective nations. And we hope that whatever governments are in power in India and will be in power in Pakistan, the arrangements reached in Simla for an overall settlement, including the old, thorny, veteran problem of Kashmir between India and Pakistan, would do nothing but contribute to a stabilization of that area. It would considerably benefit the smaller countries in the region, Nepal to the immediate north of India, wedged between India and China, Pakistan, which is a common frontier with the Soviet Union, and India, which is a frontier with the Soviet Union, to us in the middle of the ocean, south of the subcontinent, to Burma, to Sikkim, to Bhutan. If you look at the map, these small countries are wedged in a very, very difficult situation. They are wedged in between two of the greatest powers in the world today, the Soviet Union and China on the other, on one side, and the Indian subcontinent on the other. I have made no reference so far to China. At the moment, China has not shown any direct interest in the Indian Ocean area. She had, as we know, a major conflict with India in the early 1960s, and since then, she has repeatedly stated that they are ready for a negotiated settlement with the Indian government, provided India relinquishes all territorial claims to that part of the area which China rightfully claims as her own, predating the British treaties with China, which the present Indian government, which the Indian government on independence inherited and maintained was their legal right. Now, China has tremendous amount of work to do within her frontiers. Feeding and maintaining the life standards of 900 million people is a sufficiently challenging task before any government, whatever its ideology. But on the other hand, China has not forgotten the effort made by the United States in the late 50s and early 60s to encircle her, and one justification, one original justification for the involvement of the United States in what was originally a Vietnamese civil war was that if the United States didn't go to the help of the South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, assisted by the Chinese, would overrun the country, and there would be a free-for-all, a free field day, in fact, for China in the one-time Indo-Chinese peninsula. But since then, things have changed. The Chinese are more concerned about the Russian presence to the north of them, and indeed in Vietnam, rather than to the presence of the Americans anywhere in that region. The entire situation in that area has therefore changed. The so-called Moscow-Peking axis is not in the remote, even in the immediate future, less so in the remote future, a possibility which is seriously upsetting the United States administration. On the other hand, the Soviet position, not only in South Asia, but in the Middle East, is causing some kind of concern in the Western capitals today. But let me close my remarks with this observation, that if there are problems in any region of the world, and there are bound to be problems in every region of the world, we are now talking of national sovereignties. The Latin American hemisphere is far from secure from what shall I say, periodic conflicts about boundaries. You suddenly hear a football match ending in a major war between two nations. You suddenly hear the armed forces of one republic being sent into the territory of another. You have the major problem of who is to own the Panama Canal zone. Now these are recurring problems.
Unity always